here in just about a minute. So welcome.
Welcome, welcome. Oh wow. Blending in.
Sure.
You got it. Okay. Good to see the folks rolling in.
Perfect. Well, Brett, it is 11 a.m.
It is.
You guys ready?
Ready?
I'm
Roll.
ready. I'm sure some people are still kind of filtering in here. Still see that number rising up. I think we've had record attendance once again for this one, so I certainly appreciate all of you all hopping on, joining in today. Be sure to let folks know too after the fact. If they weren't able to watch it live, we can send them the recording. Should be a good one today. We spent a lot of time on this one, really diving into all of the research, and I think it's going to be super beneficial for folks of all industry. I know we put a lot of focus on agriculture, and certainly that will be a big focus, but severe weather and hurricane season two, I think also going to be a big deal this year that we're going to chat about in this webinar.
Yep, absolutely. And real quick, guys, do an introduction. Michael Clark here, co-founder, CEO, BAM Weather. We've got Brett Waltz, it's our Chief Communications Officer, Kirk Hins, President of Business Development. And next to me here is Patrick. And Patrick is kind of new here at BAM. He is going to be the guy reaching out to you today if you're interested or you've not signed up with our services. So we'll put a face with the name. And so you all can see what the guy looks like who might reach out to you and see if you're interested in any services later today. So just wanted to do that and introduce him for you all. So Patrick, appreciate you. Have a wonderful day.
Absolutely. I look forward to speaking with you guys.
Yes, we love it. We love it. Thank you, sir.
Love it. Love it.
Awesome. Well, let's get started, Brett. I'm gonna get the slides up here and you take us underway, my friend.
Yeah, awesome. So, guys, first want to give a shout out to our sponsor. And I think this is maybe the third or fourth one that they've sponsored now, Farm
Yep.
Credit Mid-America. They are awesome to work with. We'll have a little bit more on them later on in the webinar as well. But be sure to follow them, give them some love. Couldn't do this without them. So Farm Credit Mid-America, really appreciate their support on this webinar. So with that being said, let's dive right into it, get into what we've looked like, what we look like right now in terms of drought conditions, and how that's changed and where we're going over the next few weeks, because we've seen some pretty big changes over just the past couple of weeks. The map on the right here is the 8-day change, or the 8-week change in the drought
Feels like it.
monitor. It does feel like
Yeah.
it's the last 8 days it's been this wet, but we've really shrunk these drought conditions down over the past several weeks. And so I think that with more rains in the forecast, we kind of go into the next couple of weeks, it's probably going to continue to shrink down in some of those big areas, Kirk. Southern Minnesota, Iowa, those are areas that probably had the biggest concern heading into the spring season. Those are areas that have maybe improved the most over the past several
Yeah.
weeks.
Yeah, those are going to be the areas, just like this map shows, that are only going to increase probably. I think that's a fair thing to say in the pattern of the next 2 to 3 weeks, increase their moisture potential. So definitely not transitioning into something like last year where we kind of stopped that flow of moisture. It seems to be the opposite.
For sure. These are the temperature and precipitation ranks for spring so far. And so parts of the lower Ohio Valley, top 5 warmest on record. I know for Indianapolis here, it's the second warmest on record,
Crazy.
right up there with
Wow.
2010 and 2012 as the warmest of all time right now. But then parts of the Midwest too, northern Iowa, northern Illinois, parts of northern Indiana, northern Ohio, top 10 wettest of all time. So it's been warm and wet, hasn't been dry and wet. And overall, that theme continues. The next 2 weeks here, a lot of rain in the forecast, especially across the eastern ag belt, maybe the southeast plains as well. The only area that's maybe a little bit drier, southwest plains, western Kansas, western Texas, into like eastern Colorado in that region, that's the area that maybe continues to miss out on the moisture over the next couple of weeks. But aside from that, staying active, especially if you're in the Ohio Valley. And temperatures. And Kirk, maybe you can allude to this a little bit more, but that week one forecast is a lot warmer than what the model data had about a week ago. And it's something that we just continue to see happen.
Yeah, that's something we note in our commodity reports every day that we send out to our clients is this pattern has just really had a hard time changing. Like Brett alluded to a week ago, we looked at it this morning. It was a lot cooler. Now it's a lot warmer and it's a lot wetter too. So that's one thing that's been rolling for the last 2 to 3 weeks. That has been a big substance into why our forecast remains warmer, but yet wetter going forward too. So definitely seeing a feedback right now where the models are not wet enough or warm enough going forward.
Guys, and I'll tell you what, we're about ready to hop into the extended
Ooh,
outlook here. The
look at
planting
that.
season is a big deal right now. The weather is a big deal. For those of you watching that are not current subscribers, right now you can get all of our data and all of our forecasts through our application for $750 a year right now through the ag package. That includes all this long range stuff. And a lot of our customers who took advantage of the drier pattern before it got wet are in very good situations right now. So take advantage of the data and the information there. There's all kinds of stuff: spray forecasts, growing degree unit forecasts and observations, ET rates, field level rainfall totals, hour by hour forecasts. And if you want, you can subscribe to even be able to chat with a meteorologist. So I really want to encourage you guys to consider that here if you're not a customer. Listen, late May, early June, big deal here in terms of what the pattern is going to do. And right now, we think it continues to look and run pretty wet. Multiple storm dates. In fact, the model data continues to kind of trend wetter with time, throwing in more chances of rain. As we showed you here on that slide just a moment ago, just rainfall on the left here the next 7 days continues to look impressive. So we're really in this active pattern here where you know, if you haven't gotten planted, we're concerned that that can continue to pose a challenge here,
Yeah.
especially getting this late into the season. We're going to talk about this here in a minute later into the presentation. There could be some drier times in June, but at that point, you're getting pretty late.
Yeah. Yeah. These
For
rains have
sure.
just been overachieving too. I mean, look at
Yep.
today.
Yep.
So this is the big deal. This is the big deal that I think is ultimately driving the global patterns as we work over the next couple of months. It's really been a really big deal the past couple of years, past 4 or 5 years. We really haven't had a weak El Nino or La Nina state. We've never really been neutral the past 4 or 5 years. We've been oscillating back and forth between one or the other, and these big swings ultimately driving our pattern. You can see here along the equator starting to develop this La Nina. I think that this only continues to grow and expand as we work over the next several weeks. This line in the bottom right, this is the O and I evolution. That's just basically the ENSO state. You can see we were in a strong El Nino, forecasted to work into a probably a moderate La Nina as we work into this fall and into this winter. You can see the latest values here on the left starting to get towards that neutral state. It's right on time. And then the model data pretty much all going now into La Nina conditions as we work into the summer and into the fall. So here to look at the differences though, because this is something, if you were with us for the spring webinar, this is something we chatted about. The European model, not nearly as aggressive as some of the American data, some of the Canadian data with the La Nina strength. And I think that you both can speak to this, the European model has been trending lower and lower and lower with each and every run.
Yep. It has a bias with that. Doesn't like to change.
So, I think ultimately we're probably somewhere in the middle. Sometimes the American data can be a little bit too aggressive with La Nina. It's
Yep.
probably a moderate La Nina, I would imagine, as we work into this fall and into the winter. I think the European model may be a little weak. Couple of those ensemble members there with the American data maybe a little bit strong with super La Nina territory.
What's astounding too,
Well,
just quick note, is just how closely knit those other years were. Their progression on the slide just before, that's like closer than normal. I feel like in terms of those analog years, like that gives us a higher level of confidence of how strong this Nina can be and when does it change.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I was getting ready to say. I'm kind of jumping to one slide ahead of another real quick, but looking at the subsurface conditions, the water beneath the surface of the ocean. So this top part of this chart here, you can watch since March how we've really started to intensify, the body of colder water, those dark blues continue to just surface. And what's interesting that I want to point out here is how the nature of this cold is towards the right part of this chart, which is 120 to 80 west. And that is favoring what we would call the Eastern Basin, which could potentially set up shop for an Eastern-based La Nina. And we're going to talk more about that here in just a little bit, but I really want you to keep that in mind. But I show this to say that some of these intense forecasts in the modeling for a stronger La Nina, they're not off base based on that look.
Yeah, I mean, we just came off a strong El Nino for sure. So we can definitely say it's possible.
For sure. And like I said earlier, I think at the very least you're probably looking at this moderate. So you're on this side, this left side of the chart with these analogs here. I think the European forecast of a cool neutral or a weak Nina, that should say Nina, not Nino. I think that it's just too weak right now. I'm leaning more towards these charts on the left. Here's what those years did. Regardless, it's very, very warm, but it favors more of this active look, which, I mean, to be frank, we are already seeing right now across a good portion of the Corn Belt.
Couldn't be any closer.
Yeah, and the one thing I see here too, Brett, is I just can kind of visualize some south central ridging early in the summer. And then later in the summer, I can see this migrating northward. And what that's going to do June, July is advocate for this active flow pattern, severe weather risks, and even derechos we'll talk about in a second. But as that ridge would migrate north, then what happens is you shut off precip up here, you turn dry, and you open up the Gulf for major hurricane development.
Yep.
And I can just kind of see that in the analogs,
Yeah, and I think August is a tricky month in that regard too, especially as we work into August and September, because then the question becomes, okay, how strong are those hurricanes? How strong is that high to the north? Can there still be some northwest flow further north, more into the northern plains, or is it completely shut off? It opens up a whole can of worms in terms of different potential outcomes once you start adding a hurricane activity into the mix, and we will talk a little bit more about that later.
Yeah, so what you're seeing here is the oceanic signals, and what's interesting is most recent PDO observation at -2. It's the lowest ever following an El Nino. And the PDO is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It's the water temperature here in the North Pacific Ocean. And Brett has done some research on that. Brett, talk about the implications of a cold PDO for summer.
Yeah, this particular Pacific Ocean state, it's been something that we've kind of dealt with a little bit more frequently, I would say, over the past 10 years or so, especially after the last super El Nino that happened back in 2016. The fact that it's so negative following a strong El Nino is very odd. It's only ever happened a couple of times. I know we'll talk more about that later, but what it does tend to favor is more frequent lows and troughs kind of in the western portion of the country. We've already been seeing that. It's been cooler west and warmer east. And then you tend to get ridges to kind of develop across the central and eastern portion of the country. And then depending on the strength of the ridge, that's where you can get those storm clusters to go over the top. They can be up here. Depending on the strength, they can be a little bit further down to the south, like a 2010 or a 2007. And so this particular ocean state is, I think, one of the biggest pattern drivers in terms of where the warmth is going to set up as we work into the summer months. Now, it is also historically a slightly drier risk that you saw there on that last slide. And I do think that that's something to watch, but I want to make the note with that is the combination that we have just with the oceans as a whole, not super normal at all. There's already not a lot of years that went from a moderate to strong El Nino into a La Nina. Certainly not hardly any that went from a super Nino into another moderate to strong La Nina. I think 2010 would be the closest, and it was just a strong Nino. It wasn't super. And then in terms of ones that actually had a similar Pacific Ocean state, you have to go back to 2010, 1998, only 4 all time, and no years on record had a positive IOD, which is that warm Indian Ocean, in tandem with the Pacific Ocean state and the developing La Nina.
So another unique year.
It's another unique year. And I think the main point that we want to take away with this, personally, I think this has been one of the most challenging summer forecasts that we've had to do. This is my 7th year. This is, I think, the most challenging one that we've done so far because of the uniqueness of the oceanic state right now across the globe.
Yeah,
Agreed.
I agree. And it's interesting, I traveled all over here earlier in the year doing the outlooks. And it's been tough. It's been tough to nail down, pattern transitions. I thought for a time we'd go pretty dry. And so far this spring, that hasn't really happened. I do think there's still potential for this to happen into June, which again we will talk about here momentarily. But yeah, this has been very tricky. There's only been 2 years in the last 30 years where this has happened, and that makes things tricky. So, Brett, we did plot a La Nina's following strong negative PDOs, or La Nina strong negative PDOs summer following strong El Ninos. Say that 3 times fast.
No kidding.
Talk about what we're seeing here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the takeaway here is that while the Pacific Ocean alone is a drier risk in terms of that PDO, when you add La Nina onto it, especially following an El Nino, you still tend to have a moisture track through the central portion of the country. To me, this is a very clear northwest flow storm track. There's probably high pressure down here and heat, maybe a lot of heat across the southern plains, and severe weather potential. Just looking at this alone. Again, I think that we're now starting to see this type of signal pop up on multiple different analogs and pattern drivers.
I was going to say, look at May month to date. It's exactly this map.
Yep.
Already said that.
Yeah, great point. Now let's talk about the East Base Nina. We plotted these, and we actually had a little bit more discussion about it this morning. And the East Base La Ninas they keep the heat around I think regardless, it's hot summer. It's hot regardless. The Eastern Base La Ninas present a drier risk to the growing season. And the reason for that is because what happens is the subtropical jet stream is basically shut off. The subtropical jet is a byproduct of warmer waters, convection, and the eastern ENSO regions primarily as well, where that jet can fire up and carry moisture from the Pacific into the Gulf and up into the United States. The reason that could shut off is due to the colder waters, the lack of convection, no upward moving air, no rising motion, if you will, in the Eastern Pacific. Those years got drier, all right? And that is a risk to this outlook. I think summer can have some intense heat and lack of moisture spells. And I think there can also be some intense thunderstorm days this summer. Mm-hmm. It may be a summer where we don't have widespread rains. We don't have a widespread drought, but the intermittent periods of dryness could be problematic. I don't know if you guys agree with that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I kind of see summer as half and half. You can convince me like you go into mid-July and the time prior to, and it's active, still warm, and then you can go in the second half of July to August, and boy, that ridge is expanding. It's very hot, and you get the 2011 scenario.
For sure. Yeah, I think at times, you get a situation where the heat and the dryness is south, and then it expands north for a time, and it kind of fluctuates a little bit. And as it fluctuates, you get those nasty storm clusters in here that bring, wind and hail and whatnot. But yeah, and I think you can even see some of that on some of the data too.
Well, I'm sorry, my slide is going.
I was like, Michael's skipping ahead.
I don't know what I'm doing. So here is, we talked about that risk here for early to mid-June. And I want to show you something. This is OLR. This is the outgoing long wave radiation. Essentially, you can contribute this to rising air and sinking air, right? That's the easiest way maybe to put this, or air that's conducive for thunderstorm development or moisture, if you will. I want you to see this period here. And this period most recently was a period of strong negative outgoing long wave radiation in February. That OLR reached 180, which is the date line. Over here is the February precipitation map. You can see how the moisture really shut off for the eastern half of the country. It stayed wet here, but the eastern half of the country and the primary growing regions of the U.S., they were dry in February, very dry. Mm. And we're starting to see some creeping back in here of the negative OLR. This period here, this has been wet. The last month has been wet. Those are the positive OLRs. Moving in closer to the date line is a risk I'm concerned with because the 6 to 10 and the 11 to 15 day forecast is moving those negative OLRs further east. In my opinion, it can signal the transition to a hotter and drier pattern in June. Maybe the first few days of June is busy and wet and active, but I'm suspect here that the east-based Nina and the OLR moving east may make things difficult in the long-range forecast department.
Yeah, I just to add on to that, I think it could be a situation too where, maybe the first week is pretty active, like you said, as we work into the first several days of the month. The second week gets hotter and drier, and we could just have these stretches where, it seems like we're getting so hot and dry, and then as it fades, maybe it gets wetter again. I think you can have those dry stretches, but as those storm clusters move through, maybe the month as a whole still averages out a little bit wetter, but it's not excessively wet, if that makes sense. I think that those storm clusters can pack such a big punch that they can sometimes be a little deceiving in terms of how wet it actually is.
Yep. Talk about the model data, Brett, and we'll get into the overall idea here for summer.
Yeah, temperatures are pretty easy. Everything is warm. All of the analogs are warm.
Next slide.
That makes it pretty simple.
Yes.
Precipitation is where there's a little bit more of some differences. 2016, you can see how it kind of has flow more from the Gulf of Mexico. It's not really northwest flow. To me, this is because its La Nina is too weak. I think the CANSIPS is maybe a little bit of a better in between. It has a little bit of some Gulf moisture because of hurricane activity late in the season through here. But it has more of this northwest flow type of look like we talked about. And then the CFS has some of the drier risks that we were kind of talking about through here. And so I think a mix of these two are probably pretty good, Kirk.
Slight strength in the Nina. CFS, no doubt, is stronger with the Nina, eastern base.
Yeah, so Kirk, let's talk about the aridity index.
Yeah, there's definitely, and this is something not a lot of people talk about here, but we're looking at the aridity index, essentially the time frame between the fall and the springtime. Brett, correct me if I'm wrong in that time frame there, but there's a really good correlation we found between what the aridity index stands for and how it can correlate to what the summer pattern may look like. So Brett, why don't you give a great explanation on this? What are you seeing from this past fall to spring? What it could allude to? What are we already seeing?
Yeah, so as you go through winter and into spring, it's typically at the time of the year where you have a moisture surplus. You're replenishing water in the ground. However, when you get into warm and dry winter and springs, you don't get that surplus. And so the ground becomes more arid. So basically the calculation is the max temperature with the precipitation anomaly. And when we've seen these more arid conditions develop in the winter and spring, you've tended to be more prone to drought the following summer. So 2022, there was a signal for the central and southern plains drought in there. 2021, there was a signal the prior winter and into spring of the drought across the northern tier of the United States. Last year, the signal was very wet across the Mountain West and everything else wasn't a super strong signal. And guess what? It was wet out there. And so you can kind of use this as a guide for where storm tracks may try to set up. Now, this particular year, it's not super strong one way or the other. This would be maybe a slight risk for the Southern Canadian prairies, upper Midwest, that it could be a little bit drier, but for most of the ag belt, it's not a super strong signal. But this could pose the risk that maybe, and this was the spring signal, that maybe there could be some drier time lower Ohio Valley and parts of the Midwest. Again, as Michael discussed, as maybe the ridge and the heat flexes at times, but maybe not sustained. I don't see a sustained.
We had that minus the last 24 hours. That's what the map looked like.
For sure. This aridity index wouldn't suggest a strong signal either way for a drought this summer right now.
Yeah, so let's get into our overall summer analogs right now. What you're seeing, an analog is a year that is similar to this year. And we look at analogs a little bit differently than a lot of folks do. If the year isn't coming from a year that is where we are coming from, Yeah, we don't believe it's an analog. We don't look at the current state and call it an analog. We look at also where we've came from and where that year came from. And so we do that a little bit differently. Progression, evolution of the pattern is also very important in our opinions on analog packages. And so with that said, right now we have 95, 98, 07, 10, 11, 16, and 20. You can see the years right here. These are the years that make up this this forecast, these maps. It's an average of these years, right? And so those are the years that we're using. You can see the suggestion. I want you to again use your imagination. I want you to think that summer starts with ridging down here. There's heat. And then the ridging migrates north. There's still heat. And the precipitation kind of depicts this a little bit because the core of the ridge is kind of can be seen here and it kind of can be seen here. And I think in between, you've got southwest flow here, northwest flow over the top. And then because it starts so wet, it may be tough to erase some of those deficits. But make no mistake, years like 95, especially 2011, it got dry the back half of summer and it got hot.
The heat indices, I did a case study on this in 2011, were unreal in the summer of 2011.
Okay.
Which makes sense. You have the moisture, warm overnight lows.
Yep.
Yeah, and even 2010 was a hot summer with a lot of rain early in the summer, but there were still stretches, especially into August of that year, where it did get dry.
Yeah, let's talk about the analogs, Brett. I mean, this is
Yeah, I think it shows it very well. I think it shows a couple of things. Number one, I think you can see where the heat and the ridge sets up in June, and you have that strong northwest flow. And you go into July, what happens is you get a little bit more of this type of a deal around the ridge like that. And so at times, maybe you can even get some storm clusters or some upper level lows even a little bit further south. But look how it's messier. Look how July is messier across the ag belt. It's not soaked. It's not super dry. It's probably a period that deals with hot and dry stretches, and then at times you can get some relieving rains, but heat is a big concern, I think, in July.
Yeah, I think there could be some notable heat waves. The 90-degree day counts, I think, can be a lot higher this summer than they have been for a while.
I agree.
So,
and then the wild card month, which I think is August, depending on what happens down here.
Yeah, I personally, Brett, and you've talked about this, but I personally am concerned for widespread precipitation chances anywhere in the Corn Belt in August right now. And that could be when we talk about our yield forecast, ending the growing season sooner reduces yields. So if you have a hot and dry August, you are going to end the growing season sooner, especially for corn. Okay, not so much soybeans, but you are absolutely going to do that. So just something to keep in mind there. Let's head to the next slide, get my drawings off here. And again, you can see these are the official Outlook products for the summer. And again, I will say personally that, I think at times there can be periods where it's not raining. If anything, could the June forecast trend to more trend drier the back half of June? Yes. Could this forecast here, the wetness come further down into this area and it trend drier in here? Yes. I think that's possible. And then is the risk here for this to be too wet? Yes. What do you think, Brett?
Oh, I agree. And again, I think August is the biggest wild card. I'll put W on here for wild card because if for whatever reason tropical activity doesn't pick up until September, which can happen, as we go into La Nina, conditions become more and more favorable the further into the season that we go, then this is going to be the look. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
And even, in lulls in tropical activity, you can maybe still get some of this. But when it's not happening, it's probably going to get dry across the ag belt in August. Or when there is tropical activity happening, it's going to get dry in August.
Yeah. A couple of things I see here. 1017 on the CDD forecast would be the second hottest summer on record.
By one.
by 1 point. So we're forecasting again a very hot summer in terms of heating demand or cooling demand. I'm sorry. And then again, when we look here, you can see on the bottom left of the precipitation map, you can see we have some yield data here. Our current forecast for corn is a 180, and beans is a 51.5 on the yield. The trend line is a 182. The trend line in beans is a 51.8. We are below trend yields on both crops, and we're going to explain why. Brett, real quick on this map on precip, tell us, circle where it has the best chance of being wrong.
No pressure, Brett.
And the reason I say that, again, is a combination of August and the PDO analogs being drier in here. This is where I think that there could be a dry risk, Central Western Plains and into the Ohio Valley.
Yeah. Especially, too, if tropical activity decides to show up earlier, it's going to get drier and hotter sooner.
Yep.
So with that said, I'll go into some yield research talk right now. When we look at the research from a weather standpoint, we're talking weather only. We're not talking about how you plant and where you farm and your experience and your seed that you use and all this other stuff, just from weather. I think we all are old enough to agree that weather drives the crop's overall health. When we look at the PDO La Nina analogs by themselves, the formula brings us to a 1.5 below trend. And the last four most recent setups of those were all below trend yields. Okay. And that's just, you can't argue that. All right. When you go to the ENSO evolution, so coming from strong El Nino to going into the La Nina status, we come in at 0.3 below trend. Still, that's a big crop. That would be a record crop, no question. But it's a 0.3 suggestion below trend on that particular set of analogs. Now let's go to the next one and look at our actual analogs, our overall package here of what we would suggest the outcome would be. And we can see that we have years like 1995. All right. We also have years like 1998, 2007. Then we have 10 and 11, which were back to back. 10, 11, and 12 were some rough years for corn, no doubt. 12 is not an analog, but those were rough years. Then we have 2016 and 2020. Now, listen, 2016, you could argue is not an analog that is going to continue to be a good one with the Pacific state. Brett, would you agree?
Yeah. The good thing about 16 is it came from a Super Nino and went into a Nina like this year. What I do not like about 16, that's the reason it's still in the package. What I don't like about 16 is that the Pacific Ocean state, in terms of that negative PDO, that cold water near the West Coast, that's the opposite in 2016. And so I think that it's good with El Nino into Nina, but as far as some of those other drivers, maybe not great. And so it's probably a looser analog the further into the season that we go.
And that's why I get concerned with our soybean, because if we take 16 out of the formula, soybeans all of a sudden are going to be below trend yield as well.
So you go towards more of the negative PDO analogs.
Yeah. 16 goes to, helped late season for the yields, no question. So I think right now, here's the things I'm paying attention to. Late planting, that's the number one issue right now. It's excessively wet. Okay. Then what's going to happen is thunderstorm clusters can develop amongst extreme heat episodes. All right. With all that at play, with as wet as we already are, the overnight low temperatures are going to be a problem this year, in my opinion. I think we're warm and humid at night this summer.
Yeah.
Then the fifth thing I'm worried about is the cutoff of moisture in August and the turn up in heat that can end the growing season quicker. So as of right now, I don't see the makeup for a record crop based on those conditions. Kirk, would you add anything to that?
I wouldn't add anything. I think what really drives that is the current state that we're in. If everything was hunky dory right now and everything was in the ground, everybody was good, maybe that's different. Absolutely not the case. You got to add in the next 4 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks of the weather ahead of us still too. So the crop's going to want to try to rapidly grow. You got to worry about that root growth, and when we do get hot in those hot and dry stretches, that's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Disease control is going to be well elevated this year too.
Yeah. Brett, talk about what we're seeing here.
Yeah, and I think this just kind of sums up all the risks that you talked about earlier in terms of, the Pacific Ocean, that's a drier risk in here. The tropical activity, if that picks up in August, that's going to be a drier risk right through the same area. And then the eastern base Nina, it tend to force the better precipitation chances further north. And so the risk is, I would say, especially the back half of summer, is that this area that we have in that tan color would be at risk to trend drier. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the forecast, but if it trends one way or the other, that's probably the way that it's going. This is another big deal too. And Kirk, maybe or one of you talked about in a long range video earlier about how many severe reports we've already had this spring. It's a big signal too.
It's been wild. And we think about on years where we're really transitioning El Nino or ENSO to something drastically different. We're doing it really quickly. The atmosphere is going, whoa. The Michael always has a good analogy of sticking in the hot iron into the cold water. That's what the atmosphere is doing right now. And it is significantly producing severe weather risk. We had a question in there. Eastern Nebraska has a wind hail history. Just curious if the setup favors an enhanced severe risk. We've already seen that near Omaha, big tornadoes, big severe weather. This year, I would say confidently that risk is going to be at play when those storm clusters come through. I think Eastern Nebraska all the way through the Midwest is a good right there, the derecho risk of that. So
yeah, that's going to be along and north of the thermal gradient, the periphery of the intense heat. And guys, we are seeing your questions. We will answer them as soon as we're done, just FYI. So we do see those. Just outside of summer, preliminary harvest season analogs are incredibly warm and dry. There's kind of a relatively higher than normal confidence at this distance, in my opinion, at this, which again, to me, signals a end to the growing season sooner or earlier than normal. And that to me is just, something to consider here, in my opinion. Just something to keep in mind. So this is a look at the preliminary September outlook, drier and much above normal temperatures. It's far out, but again, we're confident that the warmer conditions can continue wet down there across the deep south. The next one's hurricane, though. Let's talk about that, Brett. I mean, these analogs, if anything, I think the proper word would be alarming.
I would definitely say alarming, and that's why the deep south is wet in that September outlook. It may get drier the further into the season that we go and the La Nina forcing picks up, but I think to start, if you're along the Gulf Coast, it would not be a good year to plan a vacation down there. We are near record warm in the main development region in here, where the storms like to develop. We're very warm in the Gulf of Mexico. This is ripe for a very, very active hurricane season. If we go over to all of our analogs here, the density tracks, this is basically what this is, just incredibly active in the Gulf of Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula. You can see the track through the Caribbean up into the Gulf of Mexico. Maybe not as active along the East Coast this year. I think the better threat could be a little bit further west compared to last year, where everything was kind of out to sea. If we break it down kind of year by year, every year other than 2016, which by the way, we just talked about as maybe being a lower end analog, all of these years are hyperactive. And we have two of the most active, 05 and 2020, on here, 30 storms and 28 storms. Both of those had a very similar Atlantic Ocean state. Both of them went into La Ninas. Our forecast, if anything, it might be conservative. It's 21 to 25 storms, 4 to 7 major hurricanes. I don't think there's ever been more than 7 major hurricanes, so we're about as aggressive as we can be there. But, I think especially into September, it's going to be game on for hurricane activity and tropical season in the Atlantic.
Great points, guys. And that's where, again, we want to encourage you to take a look at it, consider the tools that are offered in Clarity in the Ag Weather platform, spray conditions, soil temperature forecasts. You can chat with a meteorologist, field level rainfall totals. There really is a lot of really neat tools there. You can see the hour by hour spray conditions. They give you the delta temperature differences. Um, we have GDUs, evaporative transpiration rates, dew point temperatures, no one else has this stuff, by the way. I mean, I can tell you right now, the platform, we have spent a lot of time research, energy development, and making sure that this is the platform for the grower. I mean, this really is, among other things as well, but it is the platform for the grower. It's tough to beat, and you can inquire or sign up by scanning any one of those QR codes up there for sure. And we'll end it with that. There's the package options.
Yeah.
I do want to say, Farm Credit Mid-America,
Mm-hmm.
thank you for sponsoring the stream. As I will read for these folks, Mid-America Farm Credit Mid-America is securing the future of rural communities and agriculture, in addition to offering loans, leases, and crop insurance to farmers and rural residents. The farmer-owned cooperative provides its customers with benefits and values they won't find at most other lenders. You can learn more at fcma.com today. So, what kind of questions do we have, guys? Let's answer some.
Yeah, you want to talk about a good year to partner with some good folks in the crop insurance industry. This probably be one of those years for sure.
Absolutely. Brett, you
Yeah.
answer this one. Tyler Roberts says, Eastern Nebraska has had a wind hail history. Just curious if this setup favors an enhanced severe risk, or will it be diminished through the growing season?
Yeah, I definitely think that particular area at play, you can see it right there. And I would say in that derecho area, that is wind and hail. I think tornado may be a little bit less in that particular region. Naturally, it's less this time of the year anyway, but I think big wind, big hail events certainly possible, especially the western half of Nebraska. You think about you do get some of those drier conditions to creep in at times. You get some drier air loft that can favor big hail events. So I definitely think that is on the table there.
Yeah. We have another question here. Can Chicago expect triple-digit temperatures this summer like we saw in 2012?
I think the only potential negative or the only potential negating factor there would be the moisture.
Moisture.
Now, the humidity may be very high, which may make it difficult to get to triple digits, but I certainly think triple digit heat indices will be common.
1000% agree.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. Guys, I did just launch a poll here. If you're still watching, would love for you to vote on the poll and let us know what you're thinking here. Appreciate you all attending today. Let's see. Doug says, I'm curious about your thoughts for including 2011 as an analog year. I definitely see the similarities with the negative PDO and La Nina, but it wasn't following an El Nino.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. 2011 is the only year that we have in there that did not follow an El Nino. And the reason that we included it is because it's probably the best match with the Pacific Ocean, with the Indian Ocean, with the east-based nature of the La Nina. I think that all of those factors combined made it good enough to include, even though it didn't come out of an El Nino. It's the one that I think is acceptable to squeeze in.
Yeah, great questions there, guys. Let's go over here and see if we have any more. A lot of people asking if it's recorded, if you'll have the slides.
Yes.
We will send that out.
Yep.
Yeah, for sure. What about comparing to 1983, wet spring coming off of an El Nino?
Talking about that yesterday. Yeah.
Yeah, a couple of things about 83, and Kirk, feel free to chime in too. One reason we didn't is because we try not to go back beyond 1990, because the further back you go, just the more different that the atmosphere is versus then. It's just a different climate period. Not only that, but I believe 83 was a little bit slower into a La Nina, which is why we left it out. But there
Kinda
are
like
there are some things that are okay about it.
Yeah.
There's a question here from Chad Merrill, and he says, derechos are only predictable a few days in advance. How is it possible to forecast potential this far in advance that indeed a heat ridge will foster a derecho as opposed to an MCS.
Mhm.
Chad, it's just experience. I mean, thinking outside the box. I mean, we've seen these happen time and time and time and time again. I've been forecasting derechos for 13 years. For whatever reason, people get very scared to talk about these and mention them. I am not. We are not. We know what it takes. We know the setups required for derechos to form. In a La Nina with a strong negative AAM, anytime that AAM is going to dip down and we see a big negative dip, a big ridge is going to develop, and you're gonna throw the Pacific Jet over the top of that ridge. I mean, you're just taught that's the setup. That's the setup that you're looking for there for sure. So, great question, but I will say that it's an experience type thing. Max Hawkins asks, with the outlook for crop stress for June, July, August, what is the chance of rain in September, October, November?
Lower
Mm-hmm.
for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's September, October, November, especially if it's active with tropical activity, Gulf Coast and up the East Coast potentially. Typically, that's where the track trends with time. It's typically going to be a little bit drier west. Plus, going into a La Nina, you cut off the subtropical jet, tends to favor drier conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Awesome, guys. Well, I tell you what, do you expect to see severe hurricanes around the Gulf into October? Yes, we do.
I think
That
so.
is certainly possible. Why do you have the East Coast normal in July?
Assuming that's about temperatures, and the reason is because I think at times that ridge can push a little bit further north, that heat dome, more into the north central US, Midwest, which can allow for kind of backdoor cold fronts troughs to come into the western portion or the eastern portion of the country at times in July. But just right on the East Coast, not anything widespread or notable.
Pete Nestler says 1983 started 4th of July weekend, went through August. Tall corn, no ears. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's pollination problems.
Mm-hmm.
Makes
Anonymous,
sense.
someone said, great webinar. You do a great job. Thank you. Appreciate that. Jake says, we have been in a negative PDO pattern overall since around 1998, if I read the chart right. Do you see the flipping to positive PDO pattern at any time soon?
Yeah, overall, we've been in a negative PDO. We had a stretch there in the mid to late 2010s from like 2014, 2013 to 2019 where it was more positive. But there's really, as far as I know, not a great way to predict when that might actually flip. It normally does it every 20, 30 years or so.
I try this year, but definitely not for sure.
Well, guys, this has been fun. We appreciate all of you again tuning in today and watching the webinar. Again, for those of you who are interested in learning more, you can inquire by scanning the QR code or sign up now with the $750 a year ag option. And we appreciate you all. Farm Credit Mid-America, we appreciate you. Brett, an amazing job at presenting this and putting this all together. Brett made all of these slides, put all of this data together. He makes these work, he makes these possible, and he's the best in the business at this, no question. So thank you, Brett, for your hard
Thank you,
work
Brett.
here on that. Yeah. One more. Oh, Brian says thank you. So you're welcome. Guys, if we didn't see you on the live and you watch the recorded version, if there's anything we can do for you, reach out to us. And best of luck this season.
Until next time.
All right. See you guys.